In continuation to what we had discussed in the last lecture on trying to situate how religion and environment is intricately linked, we have also seen the linkages, the relationship, and what are the kind of role religion has played vis-a-vis biodiversity conservation and environment. And also we have begin with trying to looked at the Lin White's work, particularly on his seminal work, that is his essay titled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. So in that we have to some extent looked at the way in which how Lin White tries to go back to the medieval times, and then trying to argue that Western Christian religion is supposedly one of the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever witnessed. And it also tries to give a critique of how the Christian worldview in some way is responsible for the ecological crisis which we have encountered or witnessed in recent times. So it also tries to look at how science and technology have actually been used as a tool to push forward religious interest, particularly Western religion, that is Christianity. And today we sort of tries to also locate the two important Eastern religions, namely Buddhism and Hinduism, and we begin looking with some of the sacred texts which is particularly important with respect to Buddhism or Buddhist teachings, and also locate how conservation is being placed or situated. So before really going into what Buddhist religion or Buddhism in some sense have teach in the humankind in terms of their closeness or relationship with nature, which we have partly begun discussing or situating in the last class, that thus religion have actually a bearing on the environmental issues. Now as Lin White has White's essays have opened up a new emerging debates, and many scholars or maybe eco-theologians in some sense has tried to revisit some of the religious texts and try to see that how Lin White's argument is to what extent his argument is being valid or not. And if we sort of like agree that religion in some sense has an important place with respect of to environmental issues, if that is the case, then how do religious belief affect a person's environmental stance and conduct? Or we can also further goes on to look at can environmental issues which we have encountered can be solved putting aside or leaving religion by taking the broadest in the broadest sense of the out of the picture. Or can we also say that the modern environmentalism, is it some kind of a pagan religion? So these are some of like the big questions which sort of like emerges and intersect in two the very current trends which we are into. Now even outside religion, I mean the Europe, religion has actually been given importance, and then it has actually grown out enormously, and there is also an increasing awareness in terms of the ideological and spiritual elements in the environmental debate, most notably in the Western world. Now, which I have already pointed out in the last lectures, that how Lin White Jr. His essay in some way was one of the first to sort of like encounter how an important role he played an important role in trying to start the debate about the relationship between religion and what he actually called as the ecological crisis. Now, White actually in his essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, in some way pointed out that the Judeo-Christian tradition as something which is responsible or one of the causes of the ecological crisis because of its notion or its influence on the Western science and technology. So this particular statement became to be popularly known as the White's thesis. So White in his essay had argued that the Western faith in perpetual progress could not be seen apart from Judeo-Christian teleology. So Christianity has inherited the Jewish linear concept of time and space, or maybe a creation story, which sort of describes a gradual creation finishing with the creation of man. So therefore, man's dominance over nature was made clear upfront in the biblical text, particularly in the book of Genesis, which is the first book in the Old Testament. So in this book, that is Genesis, by sort of assigning the rule over all other creatures and the subjection of the earth. Now further in this particular essay, White sort of emphasizes the medieval belief that God actually planned all sorts of creation explicitly for man's benefit and ruled. So man himself was made in God's image and shares in great measures God's transcendence of nature. So therefore, the Christian religion or Christianity not only establishes dualism between man and nature, but indeed engages in desacralizing the nature. So therefore, this sort of desacralizing of nature in some sense also open up the way for man to exploit nature for his or her own ends. So one can sort of like pause for a moment and think that what is the solutions for this crisis? So White in some way stated that the applications of more science and technology in some sense is not really the way out, because he further continues to argue that since the roots of our trouble are so largely embedded in religions, or it is so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religion or religious in nature, whether we call it that or whether we agree to it or not. So therefore, he suggested rethinking our own Western traditions in search of appropriate but neglected thoughts. So White's essay, notably his apparent placing of the particular blame on Christianity in some sense ignited a huge debate that has been ongoing ever since. So his plea for an essentially religious remedies, however, was by and large neglected throughout his proposal to many of the priests or maybe the eco-theologians, so and so forth. So now we sort of tries to in some way give a recap of what we have discussed in the last lectures, and we are going to actually looked at some of the Eastern religion as I had pointed out, and we will be dealing with two important religions for these lectures, so particularly Buddhism and Hinduism. And as we all know that religion in some way can evoke a kind of awareness which of course is pretty much different from the Western notion of science and technology or scientific or technological reasoning. So therefore there is an immense urging needs or awareness that religion in some way help the human being aware that there are certain kinds of limitations that is to actually controlled over both the animate and the inanimate world, and their arrogance actually to sort of use natures for their own sake is something which can have a likely negative repercussions. So therefore one can actually really look into the way in which how humans' dominance and arrogance can actually backfire. So at this point of time, for this course at least, we sort of tends to assumes and looks into that religion can and in some sense provide at least three fundamental mainstays in order to assist human beings to cope with the technological society. The first is that it sort of defends the individual's existence against the depersonalizing effects of the techno-industrial process. Secondly, it also forces the individual to engage in recognizing human fallibility and to combine realism with idealism. So also more importantly, while the technology in some sense gives the individual the physical power to shape and create or even to destroy the world, religion on the other hand gives a moral strength, that is to grow in virtue by nurturing restraint, humility and liberations from self-centeredness. So human in some sense have that notion of eccentricity or maybe the idea of dominance or controlled over nature, and this is something which we have already discussed in the previous lectures, that how a kind of dominations or hierarchy is being created that is between not simply man and man, but between human and nature. Now, what does this religion, particularly Buddhism, which has of course its origin in the Indian subcontinent, that now Buddhism is one of a very old religion, and it sort of tries to preach the very notions of humanity, that is humanity as an integral part of nature, that is human and natures are pretty much have a cordial or a mutual relations. So therefore with this notion there is this assumptions within the Buddhist philosophy that when nature is being defiled or polluted, people ultimately suffer. So when we sort of like the way we act out towards nature, it also have a reciprocal kind of or backfire to humans. So we humans ultimately becomes the receiving end of our attitude towards nature. So therefore, negative consequences arise when culture sort of alienate themselves from nature, and when people feel separate from and also become more aggressive towards the natural system. So in other words, we can sort of give the idea that, or maybe in simple sense, we can say that when we abuse nature, we abuse ourselves. So therefore, nature cannot be really seen as something which is alien or maybe in isolation, quite different from the Western worldview. So what we are actually trying to look at is, as I said, the Oriental or the Eastern worldview, which is pretty much different from the Western worldview. Now, in the Buddhist text or in Buddhism, how is the nature being conserved or nature conservations being explicitly outlined in the very text called the Jataka, that is, which is a condense of both the narrations of the birth stories of Buddhism, and it has actually abundant literatures on the poetic appreciations of nature. So there is the eulogizing of the natures and its beautiful surroundings. So if you flip through the Jataka, what happens is that passage after passage, it sort of tries to celebrate or give utmost significance and importance to the natural resources like forests, water, and also the earth's wild creatures. So in some sense, you could see the significance of both the animate and the inanimate. So almost all the literary texts or the Buddhist literature states that the Buddha actually, the Gautam Buddha, was actually born in a grove of salt, which is a very lovely straight back trees with large leaves. So I'm sure like many of you might have come across a salt tree, which is huge and then it has a broad leaves. Now one can also further look into where Buddha actually engages with his pursuit of knowledge, or maybe his pursuit to enlightenment, was actually in the company of the trees and forests, and which is important. Again, one of the scientific name called Ficus religiosa is important when we looked into the life and the intellectual or enlightenment pursuit of Buddha. Now, if you go back trying to look at some of the way in which the life, way in which how the Buddhist community have actually dwelt, and more important, they live in the forest, in caves, and also under the large trees, and most importantly in the mountainous areas. So why is it that many of the Buddhist communities were pretty close to nature, and then it's simply because that most of the time they were engaged in meditations, and then it sort of provide a peaceful environment, staying aloof from the human inhabitations and so on and so forth. or maybe from the maddening route. So you could actually see that many shrines even till today being located in the remotest areas, so where you could actually experience many of the monks or the monasteries, for example, where the monks are actually regularly engaged in meditating. So if you look back at the history of how Buddhist religion actually happens to really move on, they are heavily dependent on nature, and also they cultivated a great respect for the beauty and also the diversity of their natural surroundings. So for them, the healthy forest is also a home, not just for human alone, but more importantly for the wildlife. So if a monk at any point of time accepts the forest as his home, he is also morally being guided by this belief that he should also respect the animals who is equally inhabiting the forest. So the early Buddhists in some sense maintained a kind of cordial relationship with their natural surroundings, and which is actually in contestations or opposed to the very notions of destructions of forests for or their wildlife. So again, in one of the religious texts of the Buddhists, it sort of says, for example, in the Sutta Nipata, which of course talks about how we should be familiar about our surroundings and trees, and not simply the grasses and the trees, but also the worms and the moths and different sorts of like insects. And we also should be familiar with the kind of animals, whether it's small or great, and also the fish which are inhabiting the water bodies, and the birds with the wings which sort of like dwell in the trees. So therefore it is sort of like pointed out the numerous species, which again is important and which we should in some sense take into account. Now in the works of Munir, if you look at, it sort of states that a key point of Buddhist religion is to understand our human nature. In order to understand our human nature, we need to be immersed in nature. That is, to be an intimate part of nature. And he goes on to say that the Buddhist taste for natural places that is favorable for the spiritual quest often lead to the worship of natural places. So therefore, as I pointed out, the places like caves and then so and so forth in the early Buddhist history have actually given importance, and one of their mission was the quest for spiritual salvations or contentment. So Munir actually goes on to again defines that a sacred place is a space which of course is separate from the profane. That is a space of mystery, which is both intimidating and appealing. One of the teachings of again very important teachings of Buddhism again is that the first precept is do not engage or do not indulge in killing. So this precept is not merely bound by a legalistic prohibition, but also in some sense a realization of our affinity with all those who shared the gift of life. So we don't actually have the legal or moral right to harm anyone, even like going to the extent of taking their life. So therefore, the first precept of Buddhism is do not kill. Now, if you can remember, in the high school text when we studied about the Kalinga war, where Ashoka, the king Ashoka has actually engaged in the war, and then he ended up killing hundreds and thousands of people in the Kalinga war. So right after the war, like, he took an oath that he will never engage again in any form of war, and therefore he sort of like denounced war, and then become an envoy, a special envoy of spreading Buddhist teachings or Buddhism, that is to denounce any form of war or maybe violence. So therefore, one could see that the kind of compassion or the love for humankind, that is a compassionate heart, is pretty much important in order to follow these particular teachings or principles. Now, if you again looked at the way in which how this the Buddhist monks were being advised to follow a set of principles that in the text called Vinaya, that they were forbidden to consumptions of different kinds of meats, that is mostly animals who live in the forest. So the Buddha in some way teach his disciples that to communicate to animals their wishes for peace and happiness. So peace and happiness again becomes one of the foremost important teachings of Buddha. So we have sort of like tries to look into how the very essence of Buddhist teachings are being displayed and replicated. Now, how then the Buddhism also tries to look into water conservations? Buddha himself in some way set down rules for forbidding his disciples, that is to refrain from contaminations of water resources. For example, his disciples, that is the monks, were being dissuaded from dumping waste or leftover food into rivers and or maybe water bodies in their surroundings, and then also they were also urged to guard the lives of all living beings abiding there. So now sadly in the contemporary period, because of the dumping of industrial effluents and then various other toxic items, we could encounter different kinds of waterborne disease, and many of our rivers have actually become polluted and then not really conducive or feasible for even consumptions. So this was the kind of teachings which were being circulated and then being highly practiced few centuries back. Again, in the text called the Vinaya Patika, there are also again the detailed descriptions given on how to build toilets and water wells. So human solids are not simply dumped here and there, but a proper toilet are to be constructed. So this itself shows the very essence of or the proper hygiene and sanitations are being maintained during that period of time. And then one of the 8 good qualities of the ocean again is nothing but cleanliness. So and another is that it must be the abode of various kinds of fish. So at this point one can also think that whether the water bodies are actually conducive for the fish or maybe any kinds of sea animals. So Buddhism again holds utmost importance or respect and gratitude towards nature, because nature is perceived to be the mother, and that sort of gives rise to all the joyful things in life. So the very notions of caring and nurturing is pretty much impregnated in the ideas or maybe in the thoughts of many of these Buddhist followers. And yet in another text called Metta Sutta, that is it is written that thus a mother with her own life guards the life of her own child. Let all embracing thoughts for all that lives be dined. So therefore it sort of like tries to depict the kind of relationship which is being shared between the mother and the child, and in the forms of how nature is to be perceived as Mother Earth. So Dalai Lama in one of the world gatherings in some way he's expressed his concern for the environmental protections. So what he says was that the very idea that our ancestors viewed the earth as rich, bountiful and sustainable. So this particular line in some way depict the very notions of how the earth has enough resources and which is very much bountiful and which can actually cater for the need of the humans. And again it is sort of a duty or on the part of human that to what extent we as a human are able to use it sustainably or not. So therefore the very notions of sustainable management of resources and how we as a human have that moral right to protect nature is something which can be reflected from this particular point. And as I said in his one of his recent speeches on the particular theme of ecology, Dalai Lama further points out one of the most important thing is also to have a peaceful heart. That is, we know this is the case, but only if we take care of it. So there is an urging need for a deep commitment, that is in order to care and protect. So therefore it calls for collective conscience or maybe a form of moral reformation which is needed in each and every individual. So the idea is that only when we are able to understand the true nature lying within, then only we can live harmoniously with the rest of the natural world. So in order to have that harmonious relationship, one of the urging need is to sort of have that sense of deep sense of self-realization, which is of course outlined by none other than the Norwegian philosopher Arnenes, which we have discussed in deep ecology movement. So in fact Buddhism also can be meaningful only when it is being practiced in our everyday life, and it is relevant to our everyday lives and to our environment. So therefore the Buddhist tradition counsels us to in some way give utmost importance or treasure to conserve the nature, and of which human beings have actually plays an important role, important role to play. And of course given the kind of hierarchy or maybe the sense of responsibility, we can actually see how human has an active role to play in these environmental problems which we have encountered. So for more details on Buddhist religions vis-a-vis biodiversity conservations, you can please refer these readings. So then we sort of quickly move on to the next religion, which we could be trying to look into how, for example, in Hinduism, how we could relate with nature conservation. Now, in recent times, there is an urging need from various walks of life, more importantly scholars and activists, that because India by now has encountered different kinds of industrial tragedies like the Bhopal explosion, the depletions of forests, and also the contaminations of air and water, and therefore there is certain way of a realization that as to whether the Hindu tradition in some way can be a solutions to all this, or maybe how we can try to revisit and reconsider the traditional Hindu life ways vis-a-vis the ecological values. Now, the very notions of Hinduism or the holism of Hinduism, that is there is a very notion of importance of religious texts, that is Hindu religious literature, that is beginning from the Vedas to the contemporary theories, in some way tries to engage and looked upon the idea of how a systematic approach, for example, to the 5 elements, that is an analysis of the material reality in terms of its manifestations through earth, that is the Prithvi, water, fire, air, and the space. So these elements which is being outlined here find mention not only in the earliest of the India's oral texts, that is the Rig Veda, but also it plays an important or a prominent role in the later philosophical system of Samkhya or Vedanta, and as well as the non-Hindu system of religion like Jainism and Buddhism. Now, if you look at the Vana Purana, that it states that let all the great elements bless the dawning day, earth with its smelly water with its taste, fire with its radiance, air with its touch, and the sky with its sound. So one can also look into the way in which the holistic nature of Hinduism, that is the immanence of God in all things, that is the importance or the presence of God in all things, and matter and consciousness. It also means that human in some way recognize their part in the divine creations and also respect the rest of it. So gods and goddesses, if you look in the Hindu religion, often take full or part animal form, and then more importantly, trees and plants are also being worshipped, and it actually plays an important in the ritual roles. So the very notions of, for example, the reincarnation also gives humans an intimate sense of connection with other life forms through the beliefs in the transmigrations of souls. Now, in the traditional Hindu view, the world is not something which is not outside the human body. Rather, it is seen as the extensions of the body and mind, and the body and mind actually reflect and contain the world. So ritual worship again plays is an important role, and it also, you know, is being performed by many of the people who are, you know, engaged in religious practices. Now, if you look at the works of anthropologist James Preston, while he described the experience of one of the temple priests in Orissa, so one of the first steps in the puja, that is the ritual, is for the priest to, you know, to transform his body into a microcosm of the universe. That is, it in some way tries to depict the correspondences between nature and human body. So this very notion of relationship between body, divinity, and the order of things becomes both descriptive and prescriptive in terms of the human relationship with nature, in most importantly in the Indian subcontinent. So therefore, this vision in some way tries to depict that the world cannot be, you know, separated from the human body, nor can the human body be separated from the world. Now, if you looked at some of the religious texts like the Yajurveda, it talks about the divine being as, you know, or the sanctity of life. That is, the loving sage beholds that being hidden in the mystery, wherein the universe actually comes to have one home, and then therein unites and therefore emanates the whole. That is, the omnipresent one pervades souls and matter like warp and woof in created beings. So one can also further say that in Yajurveda, that is, which I quote from Guwahati, it says that no person should, you know, kill animals helpful to old. So by serving them, one can actually obtain heaven. So likewise, which we have, you know, seen in the Buddhist religious texts or Buddha's teaching, in Ayurveda again, it sort of like prohibits the practice of this killing, and it also, you know, go on to say that he who plants even one tree goes directly to heaven and obtains moksha. So therefore, the very notions of, you know, like conservations, preservations, or maybe protections of, you know, flora and fauna is to be, you know, seen in the Hindu religious texts. Now, Guwahati go on, you know, trying to question that if Hinduism is so innately ecologically harmonious, how can we explain the current environmental situations? So this is something which we sort of needs to, you know, really question and ponder upon it. So further, if you look at the text of Atharva Veda, it talks about that dirt is not simply limited or for the human alone, but also for other creatures as well. So it also talks about, you know, the way in which where the non-human world also needs to be respected. Born of the on the move mortal creatures, thou bearest them, the biped and the quadruped, thine, O earth, are the five races of men, for whom Surya, that is the sun, as he rises, spreads with his rays the light that is immortal. So it sort of like it speaks immensely about the way in which where we also need to be, you know, concerned about other, you know, beings. So the earliest Sanskrit texts, that is the Veda and the Upanishads, also, you know, teach the non-dualism of the supreme power that existed before the creation. So therefore, God as the efficient cause and nature, that is Prakriti, as the material cause of the universe, are unconditionally accepted, as is their harmonious relationship. So further, like in the text that is in the Gita, we could see that Lord Krishna actually, you know, told or says to Arjuna that of all that is material and all that is spiritual in this world, know for creation that I am both its origin and dissolution, which means he is both the creator and then he alone can destroy it. So therefore he sort of represents the alpha and the omega. And the Lord again says that the whole cosmic order is under me. So by my will it is manifested again and again, and by my will it is annihilated at the end. So thus for if you look at the religious texts of the Hindus, the ancient Hindus, both God and Prakriti, that is nature, was to be one and the same. So in some way reverence to nature is also in some way a reverence to the God. Now therefore as I had already outlined that where Dwedi talk about where one should not engage in killing or harming others. So the Hindu also believe in the idea of cycle of birth and rebirth, or maybe transmigration of soul, where a person may come back as an animal or maybe a bird, gives this species not only respect but also reverence. So therefore the way in which we act out or our attitude to other beings in some way would have a kind of repercussions when the cycle of rebirth takes place. So this idea, or this provides a solid foundations for the doctrine of ahimsa or non-violence against animals and human beings alike. So the Hindu scriptures place a very important or strong emphasis on the notion that God's grace can be received by not engaging in killing his creatures or harming his creation. So therefore the very notions of respect for flora is again pretty much explicitly seen in the text of the Rig Veda, where tree worship was quite popular and universal. So the Rig Veda regarded plants as having divine powers, with one entire hymn devoted to their praise, and then with chiefly with reference to their healing properties. So trees were again considered as being animate and feeling happiness and sorrow. It is also believed that every tree has a Riksha Devata, or maybe a tree deity, which again is pretty much different from the Western Christian dogma, where we talk about a tree is merely considered as an object, not more than a tree, or not more than what the purpose it serves. So a tree has a deity, and then who is worshipped with prayers and offerings of waters, flowers, sweets, and maybe even encircled by the sacred thread. Or maybe we have this idea of the sacred species. So therefore the destructions or cutting downs of again trees were considered as a sinful act. Harming the trees or flora are considered as a sinful act. So the Hindu worship of trees and plants has been based partly on utility, but mostly on religious duty and mythology. So Hindu ancestors again considered it their utmost importance or duty to save trees or conserve trees, and in order to do that they attach to every tree a kind of a religious sanctity. And then if you again looked at Kautilya's Arthashastra, which it also prescribe various punishments for destroying trees and plants. Now for cutting down of the tender sprouts of the fruit, so depending on the kind of action, there is a punishment being imposed. So to cut down the tender sprouts near a city, or a fine of maybe 6 panas shall be imposed, and maybe for cutting down of minor branches of the same trees 12 panas are being fined or imposed. So therefore the the penalty which is being levied again increase as it goes on. So it also talks about the importance of how water has to be protected and conserved. Water plays again important aspects in the Hindu religion, and water is considered as a powerful source of purifications in Hindu religions. That is, by merely sprinkling of pure water in religious ceremonies, it is believed purity is achieved. For example, dipping in the river Ganges is considered to be a kind of a holy act. So in the Rig Veda, prayer are again offered to the deity of water, and the waters in the skies, or maybe the waters of rivers or waters in the wealth, whose source is the ocean. May all these sacred waters protect me, is something which we can actually appreciate, which is seen in the Rig Veda. So the healing property and medicinal values of water has been not limited alone to Hindu religion, but it is universally accepted, provided it is pure and free from pollution. So the Manu again advised that one should not cause urine, stool, cough in the water, that is by to pollute the water. So anything which is mixed with these impure objects, blood and poison, should not be thrown into water. So that will eventually lead to contamination of the water bodies. So many rivers actually plays an important considered to be sacred, and plays an important role in many of the Hindu religions. For example, the river Ganges, as I had pointed out, is considered to be sacred and respectable. So therefore the disposal of human waste, so and so forth, are being discouraged and frowned upon and prohibited since time immemorial. So therefore these notions of holism and dualism is something which we can see in the Hindu religion. That is, there is this notions of the transcendental dualism, that is the separations of humans from nature. So therefore it also talks about the very idea of how one can actually looked into this, and it also talks about the sacred landscape or river, and which can be actually, or which have been actually worshipped for generations and maybe for centuries, and one has to actually keep his or her surroundings pretty cleaned, and similarly one's own self or house is kept scrupulously cleaned. Now on the other hand, pollutions or waste is expelled out, that is in order to do away with a kind of hygienes and sanitations. Now with respect to the Hindu religion, I'm trying to bring here a case of the Bishnoi community. That is, the Bishnois have been considered or understood to be conserving the resources, or more importantly the forest resources, for centuries, and then they have actually sort of becomes an example of environmental conservations. So the Bishnois are actually a small community who are based or inhabit the state of Rajasthan, and then who practice a religion of environmental conservation. And the Bisnois were guided by these ethics of cutting a tree or maybe killing an animal or bird is perceived to be blasphemous or blasphemy. So their religion is actually an offshoot of Hinduism, which of course was founded by the Guru Maharaj Jambaji, who was born in the 1451 CE in the Marwar area. So Jambaji witnessed a severe drought in the young days, and thought that he was guided by this idea that if trees are being protected, animal life would be sustained to a considerable extent, even at times of severe drought, and his communities also would survive. So therefore he gave 29 injunctions and principles among them, which included that being a ban on even cutting of any green tree and killing of an animal or even bird. So about 300 years later, when the king of Jodhpur wanted to build a new palace, he actually sends his soldiers to the Bisnois area where trees were in abundance. So the villages which goes against their ethics and have actually protested against this, and in return, when the soldiers would not pay any attention to protest, the Bisnois led by a woman hug the trees to protect them with their bodies. So as the soldiers were engaged in rampant killings of villages, more and more of the Bisnois actually came forward to honor the religious injunctions of their guru, that is Maharaj Jambaji. So the massacre actually continued until more than 300 persons were killed defending the trees. So when the king of Jodhpur actually heard about this human sacrifice, he stopped the operations and gave the Bisnois a recognition that is a state protections for their belief, that is the conservation ethics. So till today, the Bisnois communities actually continues to protect trees and animals with the same fervor, and the Bisnoi community actually stands out as one of the best example of a true Hindu based ritual defense of the environment in India. So what we can actually see is that from our discussion so far, most religions, that is whether in the Basin, the Oriental or maybe the Occidental, most religions have a variety of traditions and practices, and as we have discussed today, more importantly in the Eastern religions, which is and also the texts, religious texts, which are open to a significant interpretations, where a lot of ideas or teachings about or principles to be followed with regards to how we maintain and dwell with the nature. Now the question also in some way which arises, that to what extent religion is actually responsible, or it can be a guide to a behavior. So therefore there is also the problems of cosmological, that is which is opposed to maybe the science or politics understandings of environmental well-being. So the idea is that how well do we frame environmental issues in a way that is meaningful, not just for the local community or local people, but from the their beliefs and practices. So therefore it is ideal to discuss how religion is again being important from different religious texts and teachings. So in the upcoming lectures, we're going to continue with how indigenous communities have been, conserving their natural surroundings or resources, or how well they manage their natural resources. And also we can conclude our discussions on religion and environment by trying to look into the way in which how the responses or rebuttal given by the Christian religion, which again tries to counter the argument which is being posited by Lynn White in his essay, which of course has begun as a starting point for our discussion with regards to religion and environment. Thank you.